biblical paradoxes. I'm not going to keep explaining what a paradox is. You should know that by now. That to judge or to not to judge. The do not judge. We hear that often. You tell someone something and they say, do not judge. And you're trying to correct them, and that's what gets thrown in your face. And it's a common expression you hear all the time, especially when someone is doing something wrong and then they throw that back in your face. Do not judge. And they like to quote that verse. And a pastor's meeting you in Wollongong. And we had a big discussion over this because we're talking about the prophet Bushiri. You remember Bushiri, right? He is a Malawian pastor who had to flee from South Africa because of embezzlement of funds and all that. And of course our Malawian pastor friends, for some reason, stood up for Bushiri. Said, no, do not judge. And that's what they quoted us. They said, do not judge. So that was a very interesting concept, and that took everyone back because the fact is he had broken the law. And besides leading a lot of people astray. So, it became quite a heated discussion, and so it's before leaving, because I had to leave, and I said to the one of them, or both of them actually, I said, okay, if a pastor is caught in adultery, is that right or wrong? And should he be disciplined? And they said, no, that's wrong. They should be disciplined. I said, but why are you judging? so they said, no. I said, yeah, because it's wrong. I said exactly the same thing. So why are you saying do not judge when someone else has done a different thing wrong? It wasn't adultery, but it was leading people astray. You accuse us of not judging, but you just made the judgment on someone else who's done a different sin. So do not judge is thrown in our face all the time. And the fact is, we all make judgments all the time. It's part of life, making judgments, and we judge people in different situations. If someone knocks on our door, we don't know. We make a character judgment, and often according to what they look like, what they're wearing. If someone is well dressed and neat, we're going to make a certain assessment of them. If someone is shabby and unclean, we're going to make a different assessment, a different judgment. Is it not so? We're going to make an assessment of, are we going to allow this person to a home? Can we trust them, or are we not going to allow them? And often not even according to who they are, what their character's like, but just by looking at them. And the fact is, we all do that. We make a judgment on people by just looking at them, even if they walk into the church. And James says that should not be. He says, if someone is wealthy and they give them the good seats of honor and we honor them, if someone is shabby and dressed, and they sit in the back, they won't even get an acknowledgement often in churches. Is that not so? Even in churches, judgments are made according to what people look like. We always make judgments, and we are always making judgments according to what people look like. And in the church we make judgments about whether someone is trustworthy to carry out a responsibility or not, has the ability to do a task or not. We make those judgments. We're having elections today. We're going to make judgment calls according to who we believe is the right people to be elders and deacons. And that's a judgment call. So we have to make those judgments. So many times we hear people say do not judge, then they make judgments about someone else. And there's So not so. I've heard people say, do not judge. Next thing I see on a WhatsApp message, they're like, judging other people, and they're thinking, didn't you just say do not judge? But now you're judging someone else about who they are and what type of person they are. So, so sometimes, we judge according to our own standards. So not that Jesus contradicted himself or we misinterpreted what he said when he said do not judge. And when the whole do not judge philosophy comes from Matthew 7, 1 to 2, do not judge. Well, you too will be judged, for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So Jesus clearly says to be judged, right? But, he says in John 7:24, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. No, it says Jesus contradicts himself, saying, and he didn't just say do not judge, but judge with right judgment. So what is he really talking about here? Is he contradicting himself? No, he's not. Not at all. And I'm going to be looking at 3 types of judgment. There's hypocritical judgment, there is eternal judgment, and there is righteous judgment. First one, hypocritical judgment, is when we judge others while we ourselves live in sinful lives in some way or the other, actively or passively. So our lives are not right with the Lord, and yet we are quick to judge others. And we make a hypocritical judgment on someone else. And Romans 2:1 says, Paul says this, therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you judges. When passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself because you, the judge, practice the very same things. And so that's a critical judgment. You who judge practice the same things. That's a hypocritical judgment. You're not looking at your own life first, but you're quick to point out the faults in someone else, and you're judging someone else for their faults without searching your own life. And an example of an active sin, there's active and passive sin. We know that an example of active sin is telling someone that's so sinful, maybe because they're in the habit of stealing, whereas you might be stealing yourself. It might be small things. It might be, that happens a lot, especially in offices where people steal from the employers. They steal stationery, a pen, or a ruler or something. It's not theirs. It doesn't matter how small it is. They take it and say, well, the company's not going to miss one pen, but I don't need a pen. Let me just take a pen for myself from their stationery cupboard, and it's stealing. Practically, you've stolen something that's not yours. So, but then you could just say, no, look at those thieves there, they robbed a bank. They should be condemned. Now, wait a minute, you just stolen a pen from your employer. That's a critical judgment. You're condemning someone else for stealing, whereas you might be stealing. Or it could be anything. That's an active sin. They're stealing. You actively went and committed a sin by stealing. A passive sin is maybe telling someone to forgive someone else. Forgiveness is not an active sin, it is a passive sin. You're not getting out to do something against someone, you're just within yourself withholding forgiveness. Whereas the wisest of sin, because Jesus commands us to forgive, and we are withholding forgiveness from someone else. Whereas we might be living in bitterness against someone else and unforgiveness and resentment, and yet we're telling someone else they should forgive. Hypocrisy, hypocritical judgment on someone else because we are committing a passive sin. Yet, now, the judgment, we might not be doing exactly the same thing. For example, we might not be stealing. We condemn someone for stealing, but we might be doing the passive sin, but we're not looking at that as sin. We're not looking at ourselves, so we might not be doing exactly the same thing as the person we're condemning. But we might be doing something else in another area of our lives that is just as sinful and wrong. But we're not looking at that because we're too focused on the person we're judging. That's hypocritical sin. And hypocritical judgment is looking at the speck of dust in someone's eye, someone else's eye, without seeing the log in your own eye. And that's according to Jesus, Matthew 7:3-5. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when there's a log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. In other words, deal with your own stuff first, your own sin first, no wrongdoing first, before you try and correct someone else and judge someone else for theirs. And before you get them right, get yourself right first. Otherwise, and Jesus clear, it actually says you hypocrite. In other words, it's a hypocritical sin to judge someone else. And that's where the whole thing of do not judge comes from. He's not saying do not judge, it's just saying the way you judge can be hypocritical if you are not right yourself first and if you're not first looking at your own life. That's what it's really the context of do not judge is. So because Jesus knows that life is full of judgments and character judgments. And the critical judgment stems from pride. Pride always sees the faults of others before it sees your own. Always pride elevates themselves. It says, well, sure, I'm right with God. I'm okay. I'm good. Everyone should look at me. Pride itself is sin. So you might not be committing anything else just by the fact you've been proud. Because that's the sin of Satan. That caused him to be cast out of heaven. The sin of Satan that says, I will raise myself above the throne of God. The sin of Satan that's got it cast out of heaven was the sin of pride. And that's the root of all other hypocritical judgment, because it sees yourself as better than others. And Jesus says in Luke 18:9-12, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray. When the Pharisee and the other tax collector, the Pharisee standing by himself prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other men. Judgment in his prayers. My goodness, that's hypocrisy at its worst. And even in our prayers, we have been judgmental to others. I'm not like others. The men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, and even like this tax collector. I pass twice a week. I give my tithes of all that I get. Look at me, pat me on the back. I'm not like them. So even in our prayers, we judgmental. That's the heart of hypocrisy. Because if anything, what prayer should do, it should humble us before God here. Because you see, what he's really done, he hasn't actually even set his eyes upon God. He's put his eyes on other people. And he's looking at, he's comparing himself to other people. Why don't we rather compare ourselves to God? Maybe that'll put us in our place. The sinless, righteous, holy, pure God in whom there's no sin. Why don't we rather, judge ourselves on that standard, and that'll bring us down a peg or two, or many more pegs, and bring us right down to our knees at the cross of Christ. But no, to make ourselves look good, we judge others. And we compare ourselves with others. Hypocritical judgments are legalistic and put rules before people. The Pharisees put the Sabbath before the healing of people. They weren't concerned about the well-being and the welfare of people. Jesus healed on the Sabbath. It amazes me. It's like, instead of them saying, wow, this is a work of God, and God is really someone who loves people It looks to the well-being of people, and it looks to their wholeness and the healing of people. What were they doing? They were just, don't do this on a Sabbath. You wicked people who do such things on a Sabbath. Oh, wait a minute. Isn't God at work here for the well-being of people? You know, and they're so hypocritical in their judgment, they couldn't see the people. They couldn't even recognize the work of God because of their judgmentalism and their hypocrisy. They didn't care that Jesus' disciples were hungry when their disciples picked crops of corn to eat. They were hungry on the Sabbath. They couldn't care about their hunger. You see, they put their legalism before people. They couldn't care less if someone was hungry. Be hungry on another day, not on the Sabbath. Basically what they're saying. Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is when you say, I'll put my laws and the legalism before your need to satisfy your hunger. And that's a hypocritical judgment on them. Misinterpreting the law, because the law was actually there for the glory of God, but also for the well-being of people. Because they put restrictions in place would actually, if we live within the confines of the law ought to be is actually protective, not oppressive. It was never intended to be oppressive, but protective and for the glory of God. They were more concerned about their social norms when they judged the prostitute who washed Jesus' feet and tried them with her hair. When they said, look at this filthy woman. Doesn't Jesus know? And then they judged Jesus as well. On top of that, they said, doesn't he know who's touching his feet? They're so judgmental because of their social norms that they couldn't see what Jesus was doing. They couldn't see that this woman was seeking mercy. And instead of giving her mercy, they were too busy being judgmental with Jesus. Not one word of judgmentalism against this woman. He could have. He's the judge of all the earth. But not one word of judgment against this woman for doing what she did. In fact, what the author said, he commended her in front of all her judges. And then in front of all her critical judges, he commended her. He didn't care about them judging him. He was willing to associate with her and face their judgment rather than shun her, because that was grace. Hypocritical judgment couldn't care less about people. They were happy to flout the law when it came to judge the woman who committed adultery. What? Pick up stones, then she needs to be stoned. How does that flout the law? Hang on. Didn't the law of Moses say the man as well as the woman should be stoned? Where was the man? They didn't worry about that. Well, they were worried about the stoning the woman. Let's get the woman. Stone her. Doesn't Moses say? Hypocritical judges. How do we know they're hypocritical? Because Jesus goes back to them. Okay, you without sin. For the first time. They all knew that none of them was without sin. They all knew that if they looked at their lives, they knew that there was something wrong somewhere in their life. And on that basis, they dropped their stones and they went away because they realized Jesus highlighted the fact that maybe the law of Moses was right. She needed to be stoned. But they also highlighted the fact that they had no right to stone her because they had been hypocritical in their judgment. You know who had the right to stone her? Jesus. But did he? No, he didn't. Even though he had the right, offered mercy and grace and said, but he didn't just leave it. He said, didn't say, I'll forgive you, just carry on as normal. He said, no, go and sin no more. In other words, go and repent of that sin and walk in that mercy that I've just shown you. That's what he was saying. He wasn't overlooking his sin, but he offered mercy. But the critical judges just want, even though they're full of sin, want to stone them. So before making judgments, go before the Lord and make sure that you're not making a hypocritical judgment when judging someone. And there's the eternal judgment. And I often hear people saying things like about someone, and very crassly, and Christians, saying someone who's committed suicide is going to hell. Seriously. I hear Christians say that. I hear Christians say, the Pope has gone to hell. Who gives you the right to make an eternal judgment? We need to refrain from making eternal judgments on whether someone's gone to hell or not. We aren't the final judges of eternal judgment. We are not the final judge, only God is. God is the only one who is the final and ultimate judge of sending someone to hell. And sometimes the way we act as Christians, we wonder if we even need God to judge, because we've already made a judgment. He's the only one who judges justly, righteously, purely. He knows everyone inside and out. He knows the facts. He's got it all together. He judges according to his absolute 100% knowledge. We don't have that. We don't have pure knowledge. We don't have every fact. We don't have every detail of a person's life. We don't know what happened on their deathbed. Only God knows the facts of a person's life. He knows the attitudes and the intentions of their heart. Do we know that? No, we don't. We cannot make an eternal judgment. And without us knowing the facts, we would have condemned even the thief on the cross to hell. When Jesus said, okay, you'll go in paradise. See, if we didn't have that fact, we would have said, that thief is gone. Well, both those thieves are just in hell now. That's what our judgment would have been. But knowing, we only know that it's in paradise because we have the words of Jesus. You can't even condemn another thief because we don't know all the facts that God has. So don't make a judgment on it. Don't make eternal judgments. It is a fearful thing to do that and to stand in the place of God. That's what we're doing. We're doing like Satan if we make eternal judgments. We're putting ourselves in the place of God to make an eternal judgment on anyone. Don't judge a Muslim. Don't judge a Hindu. You don't know what happened on their final deathbed. We can say yes. If someone has rejected Christ, there's an eternal punishment in hell. But on a specific person, do not make a specific an eternal judgment yourself. Because we don't know if his turn on their last minutes or not. We don't know the attitudes of the hearts. Only God knows all the details. So refrain from making a specific personal details. We can talk about it in general. Yes, that will happen. And Jesus talk about hell. But on someone specific, be careful, be slow. In fact, there's a quote from Gil Moody said, if we cannot talk about hell with tenderness and tears, we should not talk about it at all, because it's such a fearful place. And we won't want anyone to go there. James 4:12 says, there is only one lawgiver in charge who is able to save and destroy, but who are you to to judge your neighbor. There's only one lawgiver in church. For you to judge your neighbor. Hebrews 12:22-23. But you have come to Mount Zion and the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels, to festival gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all. God, the judge of all. And then, of course, in Revelation 20:11-13, the great white throne judgment, the ultimate judgment. Everyone will stand before God, the great white throne. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found in them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done, and the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one according to what they've done. We're all going to stand before the great white throne. And there's going to be a judgment. Yes, we know. And that's, of course, this is the comfort that we as believers, we have already passed from death to life. Judgment has already taken place at the cross. We stand confidently before that throne of judgment. To be declared righteous, to be saying, well done, good and faithful servant. But who are we to make judgments on others? Are we the one going to sit on the throne? The great white throne? If you're not the one sitting on the great white throne, don't make an eternal judgment, because there's only one who makes an eternal judgment. It's he who sits on that great white throne. And only he can make that eternal judgment. So let us refrain from making eternal judgments on anyone. Then, of course, the final judgment is the righteous judgment that Jesus talks about. In John 7:24, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. Do not judge by outward appearances. Don't judge by what you just see from first appearances. And there are ways that we aren't to judge, and that is hypocritical and eternal judgment. But that means that we should not judge. However, we should judge with a right judgment. And that's what Jesus is saying. So it's not a critical judgment, it's a right judgment. So how do we, we judge, making the right judgment of the person against facts and not with personal feelings. Okay, and many times our judgments don't involve facts, they have personal feelings. So if we judge according to personal feelings, because we maybe just don't like someone, so we judge them. That's the wrong basis for making that judgment. That's a hypocritical judgment. We need to look at the facts behind us. You know, why is someone shabby clothes they walk in? Maybe they've just lost everything. Maybe they're a good person. You know, maybe they're right with God, but they've just lost everything and ended up on the streets and they're hungry. But immediately it goes through our mind. They're walking here and the first judgment is a drug addict. How can we make a judgment that is a drug addict when we haven't even spoken to him yet? You see, he might be right with God, but he's just on the street and he's just had a bad stuff happen to him. So we need to find the facts first before we make any judgment. We all do that. And I too. I probably have to repent daily for doing this and making these kind of judgments. So we're not preaching to you, it's like bouncing off that door and coming back to me as well. So I'm not standing here all better than you. So how then do we make conscious judgments? We weigh up the person's actions against the scriptures. And Hebrews 15:14 says, solid food, which is the scriptures, of course, solid food, the scriptures, is for the mature, for those who have the powers of discernment, trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. In other words, what do the scriptures say about that person's actions, especially if it's an action, not the person itself. If there's an action, what are the facts here? What are the, so we see someone stealing. Okay, the scriptures say do not steal. Or the scripture, we're told not to lie. We're telling we just find out that they're telling lies. So but also then, what are the facts behind that? Why is the person stealing? Maybe someone stole a loaf of bread because they're really hungry. So perhaps we're so busy judging them for stealing, again, even against the scriptures, that we haven't looked at the facts, and we're so busy judging them that we're not willing to actually give them something to eat, so that we cause them to want to steal again. So if we're not willing to take care of the cause of that, if there's a real legitimate reason, that maybe they just are stealing because they're in the habit of stealing and because they're bad, and of course that's a different story. But we have to say, what are they doing, what do the scriptures say, and weigh that up. So it's not personal opinion, it's not personal, it's about measuring your life against someone else. Are they the scriptures say, talk about the marriage bed. So are people living together as married partners, or are they actually married? If they're not married, well, what do the scriptures say? The scriptures talk about husbands and wives. It doesn't talk about partners, married partners. So yes, the scriptures do condemn those who cohabitate with unmarried partners living together as husband and wife without being married. So you're not bringing a judgment on a personal feeling, but according to what the scriptures say. And that is right, because it's not right according to how I feel about it. It's right according to how God feels about it, because it's in His Word that condemns something. So the right judgment is not us condemning, but letting the Word of God condemn an action. Okay. So also have your facts of what the person did or didn't do correct. In Psalm 139, verse 23 and 24, David says, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me to the way of lasting." And he's saying, God, here I am, you can search me for all the facts about my life. Search me about all the offensive ways. Search me if there's anything wrong. And likewise, we need to get our facts correct about someone else before we make any judgments on them. And that goes for, they might not have done anything wrong. So the judgment isn't necessarily judging someone for their actions, but even whether we can trust them or not. If I want someone to fix something in the church, and they fix the electricity, I want to know that person can work with electricity. I don't want to have a problem with electricity. I tried working as an electrician, and all my clients were quite shocked at the results. So anyway, just trying to make ends meet. But you're making a judgment according to the facts of their abilities. When you put someone in a position, you're not going to do give someone the task of repairing something that they have nothing about. Never, if someone gives me the job of fixing their car, they got the wrong person. I've got no ability to fix a car. And so you're making a judgment according to the facts of the ability. So we mustn't get the idea that a right judgment is only making a judgment according to what someone's done wrong, but also what it can do, according to the best person. Or is it that when we put in someone in a position of authority, is that person faithful? In other words, not just faithful in his character, but faithful in his attendance, faithful in being able to be given the task and be left with the knowing that the job is going to get done without me needing to follow up even. You know, if I ask someone to clean, wash the dishes, you know, can I say, please wash the dishes? And now, there are two scenarios here. The dishes are going to be washed, they're not going to be washed. But surely if I made that judgment, that person is faithful enough to do what I asked. That's we making that character judgment. According to what do we judge it by? According to small tasks that we're given. That's what Jesus said. If you're faithful in small things, you can be given much. Why? Because you've been tested and judged to be faithful. You're making a right judgment. So sometimes in a church or any area of life, you might be given a small task to do. If you can't fulfill that, we can't entrust you with bigger responsibility, isn't it? Because you've been judged to not be faithful. Or the opposite, if we've been always giving you small tasks and we see that they're always done, then we can give you more responsibility because you've been judged to be faithful, a right judgment according to what we've seen in you. Recently I was receiving in my parking group, I was receiving a couple of new members, and one guy, I asked him to send me his application form. Now we could have gone ahead and accepted him without his application form. But I didn't, refused. He became a member almost like 6, 7, 8 months after he should have. Why? Because he didn't give me his application form. Why was the application form so important? When I knew him personally, and I knew that he was going to become a member. The reason is, I asked him to do a small thing, and if he couldn't do that small thing, I couldn't trust him to become a member. And I told him that, I said, the reason you're not withholding your colours, and when you come and biking a member, you get your patch. And if you see my biking, you get your patch on the back. And I'm not holding that, not because of your character, but because you have not done what I asked you, not faithful in the small things, so I can't trust you with the bigger thing. You see, so my judgment wasn't a personal thing just about how I felt about it, but according to an action. I gave him an action and he didn't fulfill that. So until he learned that and he fulfilled it, and the little things that I asked him to do, I couldn't entrust him with something bigger. So the righteous judgment, the right judgment in this case, was according to if he could follow instructions and whatnot. And so sometimes we need to get our facts together. And then of course the right judgment is always for restoration and not for condemnation. Always for restoration, not for a hypocritical judgment. There is always condemnation. Condemning. Right judgment is always for restoration. And always for looking for the benefit and well-being of the person. You want them to be right with God. You want them to do the right thing. So you make the right judgment on them. And Galatians 6, 1-5, ending with this. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you live by the Spirit to restore that person gently. But watch yourselves. You may also be tempted to carry each other's burdens, and this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something that they are not, and see themselves, each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else, for each one should carry their own load. So Now, in order to restore someone, if someone is caught in a sin, you live by the Spirit to restore them gently. In other words, you need to recognize that that is a sin. So we can't say, I'm not going to judge. Who might have judged? Let them just carry on. No. We're called to make the judgment for the purpose of restoration. Because if they're caught in a sin, we have to recognize it in judgment, and judge that as a sin. Make an assessment as that's a sin, right? But for the sake of restoration, but before even doing that, what does Paul say? But look at yourself first. Make sure that you're on the head. Make sure your life is right. Before you restore him, restore yourself and get yourself right. That's what he says here. He says, but watch yourself or you may be tempted. Okay, if anyone thinks there's something when they're not, they deceive themselves. Let us not try and restore someone else when we ourselves need restoration first. Deal with ourselves first. That's what righteous judgment is. It's saying, I will make sure my life is right before restoring someone else. But when I do make the judgment on someone else, it's not for the sake of condemnation, but restoration, so that they can be right with God. And that's the heart of right judgment, is restoration and not condemnation. Amen.